In the summer of 1941, German tank crews rolled into the Soviet Union expecting a swift victory. Instead, they met a machine they'd never seen, never trained for, and couldn't kill. The T-34 didn't just shock them, it changed the entire war. By dawn on 22 June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa roared to life across an 1,800-mile front, few soldiers in the world felt more certain of victory than the crews of Germany's armored forces. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, sharpened through campaigns in Poland, France, and the Balkans, had become symbols of a doctrine that seemed untouchable. A doctrine built on momentum, precision, and ruthless coordination. To German tankers rolling eastward that summer morning, the war felt less like a gamble and more like an unfolding mathematical certainty. Inside the tight steel hulls, the mood bordered on confidence, even overconfidence. Panzer crews spoke openly of the Soviets as an inferior force with inferior machines, repeating intelligence briefings that claimed the Red Army possessed barely 10,000 tanks, most of them supposedly obsolete. Officers reassured them that Soviet armor was fragile, poorly maintained, and fielded by untrained crews. The assumptions were woven into every pre-Barbarossa calculation. The Soviets cannot build good machines. It was a statement repeated so many times it became almost doctrine. In the early days, the battlefield seemed to confirm these beliefs. As Army Group North pushed through Lithuania, and Army Group Center smashed across Belarus, German tankers watched BT-7s and T-26s erupt in flames under concentrated 50 and 75 fire. Many Soviet formations, caught in disarray, fought with outdated equipment and limited radio communication. Even well-positioned defensive lines crumbled under coordinated Luftwaffe strikes and the synchronized push of Panzer divisions. A Panzer III commander from the 7th Panzer Division, having fought in France the year before, noted how familiar the scenes felt: columns of burning enemy armor scattered across open fields, Soviet units withdrawing in confusion, and German spearheads carving deep into territory once thought unreachable. Nearby, the gunner of a Panzer IV in Army Group South found the pace intoxicating. Targets appeared, were engaged, and disappeared within seconds. The enemy felt predictable, almost scripted. These were the moments that reinforced the myth of invincibility. German armored warfare doctrine, perfected through years of combat, made their confidence feel justified. Tanks operated not as isolated machines, but as interconnected parts of a fast-moving organism. Radios linked every vehicle. Recon units probed ahead, artillery struck with precision, and air support arrived with terrifying speed. Against this system, the essence of Blitzkrieg most early Soviet formations had no answer. But confidence has a way of muting warning signs. Even in the first week, scattered reports hinted at something the intelligence summaries had never mentioned. Supply officers spoke of unusually thick pieces of armor recovered from destroyed Soviet wrecks. A few frontline regiments claimed their shells had failed to penetrate certain enemy turrets. These notes were dismissed as errors, exaggerations, or misidentification of captured French or British equipment. Then, one quiet evening near the forests of eastern Belarus, a single message cut through the growing haze of victory. It came from a forward reconnaissance unit that had pushed deeper than expected, too deep, perhaps, for comfort. Their transmission was brief, almost hesitant. "We engaged a new type," the operator reported. A pause. "Our shells bounced." The words hung in the air, discordant and unwelcome, the first tremor beneath an army convinced it was marching toward swift triumph. The first hints of a new Soviet machine emerged not from captured reports, nor from reconnaissance photographs, but from the strained voices of German tank crews fighting for their lives in the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa. In late June and early July 1941, amid the vast battles unfolding near Brody, Dubno, and Smolensk, Something unprecedented appeared on the edge of the steppe, a shape the Germans had never seen before, moving with a speed and confidence that defied every assumption they carried into the east. Field notes from Army Group South described it as a sloped, rounded tank, a silhouette that didn't match any known Soviet model. It advanced across the open fields with unsettling ease. At first, German gunners assumed it was another variant of the BT series, until their shells struck it. At Brody and Dubno, where one of the largest armored clashes of the early war erupted, German 37 Panzer 36 crews opened fire at what they believed would be easy targets. But instead of penetrating, the rounds ricocheted off at sharp angles, scattering across the fields in what German ordnance officers called prowl, the physics of deflection. Even the early 15 KWK-38 struggled, unless fired at dangerously close range or at precise angles. Radio intercepts captured the raw disbelief. "We are firing at 300 meters, no effect." Another unit reported. "It drives through trees as if they are grass." For the first time, German tank doctrine, built on outmaneuvering and overwhelming weaker machines, met a vehicle designed to absorb punishment and keep moving. The T-34, with its revolutionary sloped armor, Christie suspension, wide tracks built for mud and snow, and a powerful 76.2 F-34 gun, represented a technological leap few in the Wehrmacht had imagined possible. Its armor, angled at 60 degrees, effectively increased its protection far beyond its thickness. Its speed over rough ground stunned even veteran Panzer officers. The shock spread through frontline units like a cold wind. Near Smolensk, German memoirs describe tank crews arguing in the middle of battle, trying to decide how to engage this new threat. Panzer III commanders shouted to aim for the tracks, while others demanded flank shots, the only place where the armor seemed vulnerable. Some tried to close in, risking catastrophic return fire just to find an angle that would bite. A small Panzer platoon from Army Group Center recorded one of the earliest tactical responses, spreading wide, engines screaming, attempting a circling maneuver around a lone T-34. Radios crackled with frantic commands as the Soviet tank pivoted with startling agility, its turret swinging to meet each German approach. Dust kicked up around them as shots tore through the air, the German crews realizing how little advantage their machines held for the first time in the war. When the T finally broke off, not destroyed, simply withdrawing, the silence in the German ranks was telling. Veterans who had fought in France and the Balkans confessed later that these were the first moments they felt something they had not felt in years of combat. Fear. Not of numbers nor of encirclement, but of a machine they could not dominate. The myth of German armored invincibility, so carefully built across Europe, had met its shadow on the steppe. Through the summer of 1941, as German armor pushed deeper into the Soviet Union, one question echoed from the front lines all the way back to Berlin. How could the Red Army, written off as technologically backward, field a machine like the T-34? For many in the Wehrmacht, its very existence felt like a contradiction, a violation of everything pre-war intelligence had predicted. German planners had built their expectations on a simple and disastrously flawed belief that Soviet industry lacked the precision, the metallurgy, and the engineering expertise required to produce advanced armor. Factories east of the Urals were assumed to be crude, underdeveloped, and incapable of matching Germany's sophisticated but resource-strained production lines. Yet now, on the plains of Ukraine and the forests around Smolensk, German tank crews were watching a different reality unfold. The T moved with a kind of raw, animal agility. One officer described it bluntly in his diary: "It jumped like a hare." Another wrote, "It ignored terrain our tanks feared." This wasn't hyperbole. The T, wide tracks distributed weight so well that mud, marsh, and soft earth, The greatest threats to German mobility became its natural habitat. Its Christie suspension let it glide across ruts and shell-churned ground with a stability German Panzer III and IV crews could only envy. And its sloped armor, unheard of on such a mass-produced vehicle, deflected rounds that should have destroyed it. To German industry back home, this was an engineering nightmare. Pre-war German tank design had been shaped by two forces: scarce high-quality steel and a deeply conservative design philosophy. The Panzer III and IV had flat armor plates not because German engineers lacked creativity, but because retooling factories for sloped armor required time, resources, and steel Germany could not spare. Weight limits on engines, transmissions, and suspensions further constrained what could be built. Germany's tank force had evolved step by step, incremental improvements, carefully calculated upgrades, precision manufacturing. The T-34 was something else entirely, rugged simplicity perfected. Welded plates, wide tracks, an easy-to-produce V2 diesel engine, and a 76mm gun that shocked German crews with its reach and power. It was designed not for polish but for war, for mass production, brutal conditions, and relentless attrition. In the field, this imbalance created deadly moments of helplessness. Stuka pilots of St. G77 reported that the only reliable way to knock out a T-34 in mid-1941 was from above, with direct bomb hits, or through point-blank fire aimed at the rear vents. Panzer crews learned the same lesson through terror. One account from Army Group Center describes a Panzer III immobilized near Mogilev, its crew trapped as a T-34 lumbered toward them. Their 50 shells struck the Soviet tank again and again, sparks flying, armor shrugging off each impact. Inside the German vehicle, the men fell silent, whispering, because they knew that if the T-34 reached their flank, survival depended on seconds. Scenes like this filtered back to Berlin, sparking what historians later called the engineering panic of 1941. Technical commissions were dispatched to the front, measuring angles, inspecting wrecks, and sending urgent reports to the Ministry of Armaments. The conclusions were unanimous. Germany needed a new tank, one that matched the T, sloped armor, mobility, and firepower. Within weeks, these fears crystallized into a project that would redefine German armored warfare, the tank that would become the Panther. A design rushed under pressure, shaped directly by the contours of the T-34, and born from the realization that the Wehrmacht's armored superiority had been shattered by a machine they thought the Soviet Union could never build. The T-34 should not have existed, but it did, and its shadow now stretched from the front lines all the way into the heart of German industry. By December 1941, the German advance had reached its breaking point. What began as a lightning thrust toward Moscow slowed, then staggered, and finally froze under one of the most brutal winters in recorded military history. Temperatures plunged to 30 degrees C and beyond. Steel contracted. Lubricants turned to paste. Engines that had roared across Europe now refused to start without fires lit beneath them. Machine gun bolts froze solid, periscopes and optics cracked. The very machinery that powered Blitzkrieg, precision-engineered, delicate, and fuel-hungry, was being dismantled by the cold. But not everything on the battlefield suffered equally. Across the snow-covered plains, T-34s kept moving. Their diesel engines, less prone to freezing, churned steadily in the sub-zero air. Their wide tracks carved through the snowpack like sled runners, where German Panzer III and IV models bogged down or spun helplessly. Their sealed systems prevented snow from clogging the intakes and mechanics. The contrast was so stark that some German officers wrote openly of their disbelief. While their own tanks required hours of coaxing just to fire up, the Soviet machines started as if it were spring. And with movement came fear. German tank crews began reporting a new kind of terror: night assaults. In the darkness, the sound of T-34 engines echoed long before the tanks came into view. A deep, hollow growl rolled across the ice, indistinguishable at distance and impossible to pinpoint. Men stood outside their vehicles with ears pressed to the wind, trying to judge direction, unsure whether the sound belonged to a single tank or an entire battalion. Then another shock: Soviet infantry riding on the hulls. A tactic called tankovy descent. Bundled soldiers clinging to turrets, crouching atop engine decks, rifles at the ready, using the tank not just as armor, but as transport. It allowed Soviet forces to surge forward with terrifying speed, overwhelming German positions before they could reorganize. One of the most haunting encounters of that winter came near the outskirts of Moscow, where a surrounded German formation, exhausted, frostbitten, and desperately low on fuel, reported seeing shapes emerging through a blizzard. At first, they mistook the forms for drifting snowdrifts, but the shapes kept growing, gaining definition, until the unmistakable silhouettes of T-34s materialized through the whiteout. The German after-action reports described the scene with an almost spectral tone. They appeared like ghosts. Panicked radio calls filled the air as the Soviet tanks closed in. German crews tried to maneuver, but many of their engines stalled the moment they pressed the starter. Others managed only a few meters before tracks slipped on ice. Those who remained mobile fired desperately, watching shells skip off angled armor and disappear into the storm. This was the winter when the Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility finally cracked. The myth of Blitzkrieg, a doctrine built on speed, timing, and perfect mechanical coordination, shattered under conditions for which it had never been designed. T-34s, crude in some ways but built for the realities of Eastern War, now controlled the battlefield. Frustration spread through the German high command. Anger flared over logistical failures, inadequate equipment, and the intelligence that had underestimated Soviet resilience. Soldiers at the front coined a new nickname for the T-34, a word spoken with fatigue, respect, and fear. Das Ungeheuer. The monster. A monster that thrived in the cold, and one that was only just beginning to reshape the war. By 1943, the Eastern Front had become something fundamentally different from the rapid campaign Hitler had envisioned. Gone were the days when German armored spearheads sliced effortlessly through Poland, France, and the Balkans. The war in the East was now a grinding struggle of industry, endurance, and adaptation, a struggle in which the T-34 had become both symbol and instrument of Soviet survival. Germany responded, but always a step too late. The Panther, sleek, deadly, and heavily influenced by the T-34's design, rolled off production lines in 1943. The Tiger had appeared earlier in late 1942, a massive machine bristling with firepower and thick armor. Yet both shared a fatal flaw: complexity. They demanded rare alloys, skilled labor, meticulous engineering, and constant maintenance. Panthers suffered transmission failures. Tigers strained supply lines and broke bridges. These tanks were tactical marvels but strategic liabilities. Too few, too heavy, too fragile for the vast, brutal environment of the Eastern Front. The Soviet approach was the opposite. As Germany perfected, the USSR multiplied. T evolved into the T-34-85, equipped with a new 3-man turret and an 85mm gun capable of challenging Panthers and Tigers head-on. And while German factories produced their advanced tanks by the hundreds, Soviet industry produced T-34s by the tens of thousands. By the end of the war, more than 80,000 T-34s had been built, making it the most produced tank of the Second World War, and one of the most influential armored vehicles in history. This numerical tidal wave had consequences far beyond tank versus tank engagements. For Germany, it altered strategy itself. The early encounters of 1941, when German crews watched their shells ricochet harmlessly off angled armor, forced the Wehrmacht to rethink assumptions, reorganize doctrine, and slow offensives at the very moment speed mattered most. Logistics strained as new weapons were rushed east. Artillery was repositioned. Air support was redirected. What had once been a confident march toward Moscow became a protracted, draining war of attrition, one Germany was never built to win. The T-34 did not defeat the Wehrmacht alone, but it disrupted German planning at a critical moment, stalled the advance toward the Soviet capital, and bought the Red Army time to evacuate factories, mobilize millions, and reorganize shattered armies. Time for the Soviet Union to survive. Decades later, German veterans still remembered those first encounters with a mix of respect, disbelief, and lingering fear. Memoirs recorded raw honesty. We had no idea such a machine existed. It was the shock that woke us up. They spoke not only of battles lost, but of an illusion shattered, the illusion of unquestioned technical superiority. The T-34 had forced Germany to confront a hard truth. The war they thought would be won by precision, and Blitzkrieg would instead be decided by endurance and production. And so the T-34's legacy is larger than steel, armor, or numbers. It became a symbol of resilience, of industrial will, of a nation fighting at the edge of annihilation. To Soviet soldiers, it was more than a machine. It was mobility when retreat meant death. It was protection when the front collapsed. It was the heartbeat of a country refusing to disappear. In the end, this tank did not just fight a war. It helped decide the fate of an empire.